Pulpits make me a little nervous. You always put your feet right over the top of the audience, so I hope I won't step on anybody's head. I thank you for the opportunity to speak here where I've been before. And I am grateful to Professor Moore and to all of my critics, really. The great assurance-giving thing for a writer is to assume that he'll be disagreed with. If I got the impression that somebody believed everything I said, I think I would be literally dumbfounded. I would be afraid to say anymore. Because, but anyway, I'm grateful particularly for this criticism because it required me to think it through again, or to think it through for the first time. I must say that it's a little wonderful to me that in 40-odd years of taking stands on controversial issues, and at great length sometimes, the two times when I think I've stirred up the most passionate opposition has been with a tiny little essay on computers and half a dozen or a dozen sentences on gay marriage. Well, Professor Moore's paper is cordial, and rather than respond directly to it, I thought I'd just take this occasion to make a sort of general declaration on this subject. In the present political atmosphere, it is assumed that everybody must be on one of only two sides, liberal or conservative. It doesn't matter that neither of these labels signifies much in the way of intellectual responsibility, or that both are paralyzed in the face of the overpowering issue of our time, the destruction of land and people, of life itself, by means either economic or military. What does matter is that a person should choose one side or the other, accept the thinking and the positions of that side and its institutions, and be so identified forevermore. How you vote is who you are. Above all, one must not cause confusion among the loyalists. If the liberals or conservatives agree with you on one thing, they're entitled to be shocked to find that they don't agree with you on everything. It follows that you must not change your mind about mere issues. The only change that is expectable or normal is to go from one of these disreputable sides all the way over to the other, changing in effect your identity, which is understood to be no more or less than your side. We appear thus to have evolved into a sort of teenage culture of wishful thinking, of contending positions, oversimplified and absolute, requiring no knowledge and no thought, no loss, no tragedy, no strenuous effort, no bewilderment, no hard choices. Of the contention of American conservatives and liberals in the Cold War politics of the 1950s, John Lukács remarked that the opposition of two stupidities does not mean that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Nowhere has this callow politics asserted itself more thoughtlessly and noisily than on the rights of abortion and homosexual marriage. The real issue here is the politicization of personal or private life, and inevitably, given the absence of authentic political discourse, the reduction of the issues to two absolute positions. In addition to distracting from interests authentically public and political, the politicization of personal life, involving as it must the publicization of privacy is inhumane and inherently tyrannical. After Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago was published in the West, receiving the Nobel Prize in 1958, and the bitter Soviet reprisal against Pasternak, Thomas Merton wrote, "Communism is not at home with non-political categories, and it cannot deal with a phenomenon which is not in some way political. It is characteristic of the singular logic of Stalinist Marxism that when it incorrectly diagnoses some phenomenon as political, it corrects the error by forcing the thing to become political." Paradoxically, perhaps, after our many decades of anti-communism, Merton's sentences have come to be descriptive of our own politics. Or maybe this is not paradoxical. Maybe people who focus their minds for a long time upon enmity against their enemies finally begin to resemble their enemies. This has happened before. It is deeply embedded in the logic of warfare. Whatever the cause, we seem to have become as adept as the old Soviet Union in politicizing the non-political. Most remarkably, by the connivances of both political sides, we have invented a politics of sexuality, which by the standards of our own political tradition is a contradiction in terms. Or it is, if there is to be a continuing political distinction between public and private. This distinction, after all, is the basis of the freedoms affirmed by the First Amendment, which holds essentially that people's thoughts and beliefs are of no legitimate interest to the government. The government is not in charge of our personal lives, our private affections, our prayers, or our political opinions. It is not in charge of our souls. Those who formed our government also limited it, forbidding it any freehold in our homes or in our minds. I am as ready as any so-called conservative to worry about big government, though I would remember that government has gotten big in the much-needed effort to regulate big corporations and to help their victims. To my fear of big government, I add my at least equal fear of unlimited government, which is to say, total government. It is not entirely surprising that after our long, costly resistance to communist dictatorship, we should now see the rise of passions and excuses tending toward capitalist dictatorship. The most insidious of these passions tends toward state religion and government regulation of private behavior. The politics of sexuality has to do with public disagreements about rights, which, however valid, are newly proclaimed, obscure in origin, extremely controversial, and productive of conflicts that probably are not politically resolvable. Regarding homosexual marriage, the fault that I must acknowledge is that in what I have said before, I have not been complete enough. So far as I remember, I have made only 2 public statements about this issue. The first was in a single paragraph in a collection of essays, The Way of Ignorance, published in 2005. The second was in an interview for an article in National Review in 2012. My argument, much abbreviated both times, was that sexual practices of consenting adults ought not to be subjected to the government's approval or disapproval, and that domestic partnerships in which people who live together and devote their lives to one another ought to receive the spousal rights, protections, and privileges that the government allows to heterosexual couples. In those 2 statements, I considered homosexual marriage as an issue of law, with reference to the contention from both sides that marriage is a right to be granted or withheld at the wish of whichever side may dominate by the government. This puts me in the middle, but with some certainty of my whereabouts, and with good reasons to object. First, this right to marriage is still birth wet. It exists oddly only by reason of its being selectively withheld. Apart from its momentary political expediency, there is no reason for it. Whatever one may think of all that is presently implied and entailed by the legalization of marriage, surely nobody can claim that marriage is either the government's invention or the government has an inherent right to determine who may marry. Second, this right depends upon a curious agreement between liberals and conservatives that human rights originate in government, to be dispensed to the people according to their pleading and at the government's pleasure, implying inescapably that any right, being so expediently the government's gift, can just as expediently be withheld or withdrawn by the government. This flatly contradicts the founding principle of American democracy, that human rights are precedent to the government's existence, that the government is established to protect them, and that the government must be restrained from violating them. Third, it cannot be allowable under the above principles for the government, on the pleading of some of the people, to establish a right solely for the purpose of withholding it from some other people. This, if it were to happen, would be a punishment imposed upon a disfavored group for no crime except their existence. I don't need to point out that this has happened before. That the liberals, who so often have been rightly anxious for the protection of rights and liberties, should define those rights and liberties as merely the gifts of a generous and parental government is absurd. The conservative program on this issue, promoting as it does a constitutional apportionment of rights according to sexual category, in implicit violation of the 15th and 19th Amendments, is more darkly absurd. It also raises absurdity to high comedy in the theory that accreditation of the sexual practices of individuals is a function proper to a small and non-interfering government. That homosexuals have been denied the right to marry, supposing for the moment that such a right can exist, surely violates the 14th Amendment, which forbids the state to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or to deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. There is no need for homosexuals to be granted a right to marry that is at all different from the right of heterosexuals to do so. There is no good reason for the government to treat homosexuals as a special category of persons, which is the same discrimination that has been removed from races and increasingly from women. To support their strategy of outlawing homosexual marriage, Christians of a certain disposition have found several ways to categorize homosexuals as a different kind from themselves, who are in the category of heterosexuality and therefore normal and therefore good. They are mindful that the Bible looks upon homosexual acts as sinful or perverse. But it is not clear to me why perversion should have been so specifically assigned to homosexuality. The Bible, as I pointed out to the writer for National Review, has a lot more to say against fornication and adultery than against homosexuality. If one accepts the 24th and 104th Psalms as scriptural norms, then surface mining and other forms of earth destruction clearly are perversions. If we take the gospel seriously, how can we not see industrial warfare with its inevitable massacre of innocents as a most shocking perversion? By the standard of all the scriptures, neglect of the poor, of widows and orphans, of the sick, the homeless, the insane, is an abominable perversion. Jesus taught that hating your neighbor is tantamount to hating God, and yet some Christians hate their neighbors by policy and are busy hunting biblical justifications for doing so. Are they not perverts in the fullest and fairest sense of that term? And yet none of these offenses, not all of them together, has made as much political religious noise as homosexual marriage. Another way to categorize and isolate homosexuals from the general citizenry and the prerogatives of citizenship is to define homosexuality as a disease, supposing that homosexuality has a cause that can be discovered and removed or cured by some sort of therapy. This seems most promising as long-term job security for scientists. Ken Kesey once saw an inscription in a men's room, "My mother made me a homosexual." Under it, somebody else had written, "If I gave her the yarn, would she make me one?" My own speculation is that we will never do much better than that. We will discover that like all the rest of us, homosexuals are made what they are by their mothers, their fathers, their genes, their germs, their upbringing, their education, by their friends and neighbors, their dwelling places, their time and its culture, by their economic and social status, by their personal history, and by history. Another such argument, of course, is that homosexuality is unnatural. If the nature in question is merely biological, the realm of the ape and the naked ape, that may prove too roomy and accommodating to be of much help. By the standard of that nature, monogamous marriage itself is unnatural. It is an artifact of some cultures. If it is argued that homosexual marriage cannot be reproductive, is therefore unnatural, and should be forbidden on that account, must we not then argue that childless marriages are unnatural and should be annulled? Specifically, human nature, by contrast, has always had a definition more complex and demanding than that of a naked ape. William Blake thought we were made human by being made in the image of God. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man, his child, and care. Are homosexuals capable of mercy, pity, peace, and love? Some certainly are, as some heterosexuals certainly are. To deny that distinction to homosexuals is to deny categorically that they are human, hardly a job for mercy, pity, peace, and love. The perception of a duality, sometimes a conflicting duality in human life, a profound and troubling difference between natural nature, so to speak, and human nature, was continuous in our culture until our own age of scientific materialism. In the great chain of being, now much maligned but never replaced, we humans stand between the animals and the angels, partaking of both natures, attracted and influenced by both. This duality is resolved not by victories over enemies, but by fidelity to our own nature. This is difficult, involving always our ignorance, our unintelligence, and therefore much confusion and suffering. And this difficulty defines exactly our need for mercy, pity, peace, and love. Oversimplified moral certainties, always requiring hostility, always potentially violent, isolate us from mercy, pity, peace, and love, and leave us lonely and dangerous in our misery. The only perfect laws are absolute, but perfect laws are only approximately fitted to imperfect humans. That is why we have needed to think of mercy and of the Spirit as opposed to the letter of the law. One may find the sexual practices of homosexuals to be unattractive or displeasing, and therefore unnatural. But anything that can be done in that line by homosexuals can be done and is done by heterosexuals. Do we need a political remedy for this? Would conservative Christians like a small government bureau to inspect, approve, and certify their sexual behavior? Would they like a colorful tattoo verifying government approval on the rumps of lawfully copulating parties? We have the technology, after all, to monitor everybody's sexual behavior. But so far as I can see, so eager an interest in other people's most private intimacy is either prurient or totalitarian or both. The oddest of the strategies to condemn and isolate homosexuals is to propose that homosexual marriage is opposed to and a threat to heterosexual marriage, as if the marriage market is about to be cornered and monopolized by homosexuals. If this is not industrial capitalist paranoia, it at least follows the pattern of industrial capitalist competitiveness. You must destroy the competition. If somebody else wants what you've got, from money to marriage, you must not hesitate to use the government, small, of course, to keep them from getting it. But hold on. If heterosexual marriage is so satisfying to homosexual couples, why can they not just reside in their satisfaction? So-called traditional marriage, now mostly divested of a traditional household and traditional bonds to a community, is for sure suffering a statistical failure. But this is not the result of a homosexual plot. Heterosexual marriage does not need defending. It only needs to be practiced, which is pretty hard to do just now. But the difficulty is not assignable to any group of scapegoats. It is rooted mainly in the values and priorities of our industrial capitalist system in which every one of us is complicit. I have dealt so far with the politics of a legal definition of marriage. It certainly is possible for a government to withhold the legal perquisites of marriage from any group that it may designate, or that it may be persuaded to designate in our present civil Cold War. That is mainly to say that a government can forbid its officers to license weddings for people in the designated group. But a wedding is not a marriage. A wedding, in some circumstances, for some people, may be a sacrament. It is traditionally an exchange of vows of fidelity and love in all circumstances until death. A wedding, however complicated and costly the preparations, the costumes, the photography, and the reception, is made and done with in a few minutes. A marriage, by contrast, is the making of marriage. The effort day by day to live out the vows until death. The vows in the long making may be taken seriously or not, broken or not, but there is no way of withholding them from homosexuals. You cannot exclude homosexuals from their language, and you cannot copyright the vows, which a homosexual couple is perfectly free to make. The government cannot forbid them to do so, nor can any church. They can be spoken in secrecy, in whispers, by any couple wanting to speak them. Conjugal love, Kierkegaard wrote, is faithful, constant, humble, patient, long-suffering, indulgent, sincere, contented, vigilant, willing, joyful. All these virtues, he said, have the characteristic that they are inward qualifications of the individual. inward qualifications. The individual is not fighting with external foes, but fights with himself. Conjugal love does not come with any outward sign, with whizzing and bluster, but it is the imperishable nature of a quiet spirit. That's from Either Or. No church can make this marriage because it cannot make any marriage, nor can it withhold any degree of blessedness or sanctity from any pledged couple striving day by day to be at one. If I were one of a homosexual couple, the same as I am one of a heterosexual couple, I would place my faith and hope in the mercy of Christ, not in the judgment of Christians. When I consider the hostility of political churches to homosexuality and homosexual marriage, I do so remembering the history of Christian war, torture, terror, slavery, and annihilation against Jews, Muslims, black Africans, American Indians, and others, and more of the same by Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against Catholics, Catholics against Catholics, Protestants against Protestants, as if by law requiring the love of God to be balanced by hatred of some neighbor for the sin of being unlike some divinely preferred us. If we are a Christian nation, as some say we are, using the adjective with conventional looseness, then this Christian bloodthirst continues wherever we find an officially identifiable evil, and to the immense enrichment of our Christian industries of war. Condemnation by category is the lowest form of hatred, for it is cold-hearted and abstract, lacking the heat and even the courage of a personal hatred. Categorical condemnation is the hatred of the mob, which makes cowards brave. And there is nothing more fearful than a religious mob, a mob overflowing with righteousness, as at the crucifixion and before and since. This can happen only after we have made a categorical refusal of kindness to heretics, foreigners, enemies, or any other group different from ourselves. Perhaps the most dangerous temptation to Christianity is to get itself officialized in some version by a government, following pretty exactly the pattern of the chief priest and his crowd at the trial of Jesus. For want of a pilot of their own, some Christians would accept a Constantine, or whomever might be the current incarnation of Caesar. Kindness is not a word much at home in current political and religious speech, but it is a rich word and a necessary one. There is good reason to think that we cannot live without it. Kind obviously is related to kin, but also to race and to nature. In the Middle Ages, kind and nature were synonyms. Equal, in the famous phrase of the Declaration of Independence, could be well translated by these terms. All men are created kin to one another, or of a kind, or of the same race or nature. Jesus saves the life of the woman taken in adultery by removing her from the category in which her accusers, another mob, have placed her, and placing her within kindness, his own kindness first, and then that of her accusers. He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. The accusers take this kindness as a defeat, as we all are too likely to do, and they depart without another word. The brief dialogue that follows is wonderfully animated by Jesus' sense of humor. Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? No man, Lord. Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Good advice. But can we suppose he could have given it without smiling, knowing as he did the vast repertory of sins and the endless human susceptibility? Within the larger story of the Gospels, this story is not exceptional. It does show us Jesus' way of dealing with one of the biblically denominated sins. But he simply reaches out to the woman in her great need, as he did many times to many others. In the Gospels, the sinfulness of humans is assumed. It is a universal. It is neediness that is exceptional. And in Jesus' ministry, clearly takes a certain precedence over sin. His kindness is best exemplified by his feedings and healings with no imputation at all of sin or deserving to the beneficiaries. But the wealth of this idea of kindness is not exhausted by kindness to humans. It is far more encompassing. Coming from as far back among Christians, at least as the 12th century, certainly from farther back in so-called primitive cultures, cropping up again in the thought of some ecologists of our own time, is the idea of a great kindness, including and binding together all beings, the living and the non-living, the plants and animals, the water, the air, the stones. All ultimately are of a kind, belonging together interdependently in this world. From the point of view of Genesis 1 or of the 104th Psalm, we would say that all are of one kind, one kinship, one nature, because all are creatures. Much happiness, much joy can come to us from our membership in a kindness so comprehensive and original. It is a shame, as I know from long acquaintance with myself, to be divided from it by the autoerotic pleasure of despising other members.